the European Greenbelt is something that was set up kind of officially around 2005, because after the fall of the Soviet Union and that this, what was a closed border, was kind of opened up, what all these countries discovered was that in what was a no man's land, there was actually like really profoundly flourishing wildlife, and this out of bounds no man's land had become a kind of sanctuary for endangered species and had become a wildlife corridor. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, when this border was opened up, all the countries along it basically pledged to maintain these areas of kind of biological diversity and importance as national parks and nature reserves. So the European Greenbelt is, sort of use the official terminology, it's a cross-border initiative, and it was initially a grassroots movement for nature conservation and sustainable development along the corridor of the former Iron Curtain. The European Greenbelt is both the name of the environmental initiative, and it's also the name of the kind of referring to the land itself. And it's literally a chain of national parks and nature reserves that runs from the Barents Sea in the Arctic Circle all the way down to the Black Sea. And I basically heard about the European Greenbelt as an idea actually on a podcast, and I'd been looking for a sort of follow-up, or not really a follow-up, but just like a next step that would make some kind of sense to like the arc of my work. So the project that I've been doing as part of my master's and also afterwards in an exhibition was a body of work about my Polish grandmother's experiences during the Second World War as a teenager fighting against the Nazis. And I'd basically travelled across Poland and Germany retracing her steps in visiting the sites of all these prisoner of war camps that she'd been held in at the age of 19 after the Warsaw Uprising of 44. And so to me, when I heard about the European Greenbelt as a kind of like a thing that exists that I'd never heard of before, I thought that's so interesting that there is something that is so environmentally important that came out of something so divisive and so violent and oppressive and politically charged. And to me, the kind of idea of the European Greenbelt is just such an interesting idea because it's this intersection of history, politics, you know, nature, wilderness, environmentalism. Like there's so many sort of things that meet within the subject. So just to sort of give it some context, I had some funding from the Royal Photographic Society Environmental Bursary, which covered the sort of first part of the project. I then managed to secure some private funding from somebody who really believes in the project and wanted me to finish it. So that covered sort of most of the rest of it. And so in 4 trips or 5? I think it was 4. I've travelled the whole length of the Greenbelt, and I took photos and I spoke to lots of people and I did field recordings and interviews, and yeah, I'll just show you some of the pictures now. So the project is obviously absolutely massive, which is something that I'm now struggling with, because putting it into a book it basically needs to be like 5 books or like 5 small books that then go in a box or something. So I'm figuring out what the best way to sort of package it as a book project. But just to go back to the map, so at the top there, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there's a tiny bit of Norway right there where the Greenbelt begins. So as I show you these slides, we're just going to move literally all the way down. So Norway, and I might just stop speaking for a second while I flick through some of these pictures. I'm sure some of you might have seen these before, because these early ones, you know, they were made back in 2017. So it's definitely a long-term project, which is only now only really now just finished. I guess if anyone has any questions about any specific photos, just pop them in the chat box. I can't actually see the chat box right now, but we can come back to it later. So just for some context, this guy, he's a park ranger in an incredibly beautiful national park on the border between Russia and Norway called Ovre Pacific National Park, and his name is Ralph. And he, this is from within his cabin, and that's actually a frozen lake, and on the other side of the lake is Russia. So this is quite a brief sort of cross section of pictures. There's not yeah, I mean, I could tell you what's in every picture, we might be here all night. So there's something quite amazing about being sort of within the Arctic Circle, because it's really just like the way that especially in Finland and Norway, basically the relationship between people and their environment is so different to how it feels in the UK, at least, and if not, I could maybe say it feels different to Western Europe in my experience. For example, in Finland, anyone is allowed to go and sleep out in the wilderness for, I think it's 2 nights. That's what it was when I was there anyway. Like it's your right to do that. You can't be moved on. And it's your right to pick berries and mushrooms. So they really encourage people to, I think, have a much healthier relationship to wilderness and to the natural environment. I mean, if I compare it to here in Britain, it just feels like everywhere you turn there are rules telling you to stay out of places and to not engage with nature unless you're kind of able to afford to. So yeah, so that's just something that was really kind of interesting in Finland. This was at a research center, a scientific research center, who are doing investigations into sort of climate change and environmental changes. And what's quite interesting as well is that the guy on the right here, he had not long finished school, and he'd been given a spot to learn at this research center, and they only have 1 spot every year. And basically, when you leave school in Finland, you have to spend a year either doing community service or in the army. And by community service, it can be like doing what this guy did, which is going and learning, basically volunteering for a year at this research center. But in the few months he'd been there, by the time I got there, he already kind of knew, the name of every plant, every lichen, every moss in the forest. So he was a pretty good guide for wandering around. That's obviously taxidermy. For wandering around in the national park, which was on the border with Russia. So I'm actually going to take an executive decision. Oh, actually, let me tell you about this picture. This is quite an interesting one. So this is taken right on the border with Russia, and it's an angel sort of overseeing the handshake of a Russian soldier and a Finnish soldier. And that was actually from after not even the Second World War, it was the previous war, and it just felt like quite a poignant photo, mural to take a photo of. Because the interesting thing about the Finnish-Russian border is that the national parks are really seen as a peacekeeping thing. It was said to me quite a few times by a few different people how important the national parks are on the border with Russia, that they exist. And even when you drive towards the border, the land goes like this. I don't know if you can see my hand, or if you're, well, anyway, it sort of undulates. So there's a natural defense in the land on the border, so you can't see what's over the brow of the hill. And I know that when I was traveling there, there'd been sort of not long this sort of news that the Finns had discovered that lots of Russian basically military personnel with their private money, had been buying holiday homes just inside the Finnish border. And it seemed like some sort of, I mean, who knows if it was a conspiracy theory. I think the Finns were thinking it's not a conspiracy theory, but there was this kind of like underhand way of like maybe trying to reoccupy the land in some way, but in this kind of passive way. But then it turned out all the people buying houses were from the Russian military, and that raised alarm bells. So yeah, so this picture feels poignant for that. But I'm going to make an executive decision and say that when we get to the end of Finland, I'm actually going to stop showing you photos, because otherwise this will take forever. So this picture, I'm quite fascinated by this picture because the water really was orange, and I'm told that it's because of the peat off the land. So as the river was, as the snow was sort of melting off the land as I travelled south, yeah, you just sort of see this incredible colour on the ice. So all along the Russian border are trees that have these yellow sort of stripes painted on them that have then been replaced by these plastic sort of ribbons. And that's basically to denote an area that you're not allowed to walk into without a permit. And that means you're, I think it was half a mile or a mile in some cases from the actual border, like line with Russia. So this you saw, you know, from start to finish all down Finland. Okay, so that's actually the end of Finland. So if you'd like to know more about that project, we'll have to do this another time. So just to briefly then tell you about, let me just see if I can get to the appropriate slide. Nope. I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to tell you briefly about photo scratch, which is something else I do. I should have mentioned that at the start, I guess. I run photo scratch, which is a work in progress night. Oh my goodness, sorry, there are loads of slides in here. Here we go, this is photo scratch. So I run photo scratch, which is a work in progress night for documentary photographers and a sort of networking night. And it's free to be part of, and it's free to attend. And the idea is that it's a kind of open community event where you can get some like a cross-section of feedback about a work in progress project. We've been running since the beginning of 2016, and we've basically kept going because there's been the demand for it, which has been great. It's something that we run voluntarily. It normally looks like that in a space, in a pop-up space, with photographers sharing work in progress. There are feedback forms. So each photographer who participates, and it's the photographers who participate have done an application to be part of it. They leave with a bundle of feedback about their work, and hopefully they've had lots of good conversations. During lockdown, we've actually already run 2 online in the spring, and we're hoping to run another 2 this winter, still online. So that's been amazing because we can actually connect with photographers outside London or outside, well, we did it in Bristol once, but yeah, photographers from further afield, and you know, we wouldn't do that in normal times. So it's kind of got a silver lining to it. I also wanted to talk about Isle, which I think probably the best thing I can do actually is I just stop sharing for a second and then I will reshare in a sec. So I'll just share our website with you. So Isle is a very small collective that I set up with Celine Marchbank, Linda Laird and Nicola Muirhead. We've been working together now for just over a year, and we had our launch in December, the end of last year. And basically Isle has come about because we're all kind of jobbing photographers, and we just found that we had a bit of like a gap in what we were doing, in that we'd often spend a long time working on projects, and maybe they'd be published somewhere, but actually we didn't often have a chance to exhibit our work. And like lots of people had kind of said to each of us at different moments, like that they, you know, they'd like to see exhibited work or by prints. And so we've basically started to do kind of group curations and group projects as a way to kind of stimulate our own practices, I think, in a way that we wouldn't otherwise be doing as kind of jobbing photographers. And it's been really great, actually, because it's made, I mean, we've all got kind of experience, you know, editing our own work and editing and teaching and you know, sort of doing all these different things, but actually curating projects together as a group and kind of working with the images has been really like fulfilling in a really unexpected way. So yes, whilst lockdown and everything that's been horrendous has slightly slowed us down, we are still plugging away at it and hoping to bring everyone another exhibition soon. I'll also just quickly show you, this is the Photo Scratch website if anyone wanted to look at that later. I'm maybe going to stop there. We can, if anyone has questions about anything that I've mentioned or anything they want to know more about specifically, like, please do drop questions into the chat box, but I'm going to stop there. And I hope I've stopped. Have I stopped sharing my screen? I think
yes,
I have.
do stop sharing your screen. Thank you so much, Hannah. I honestly could just sit and listen to you talk about your photos for about 5 hours. It's just so I just think, and it's just, there's just such beautiful visuals. So thank you so much for talking us through some of that work. Yeah, so as promised at the start of the session, we're going to start off just with some questions that we've received in advance. I've also, to be honest, I've been like getting a load of questions in my head as well, because I think there's a few things I'd like to ask you as well. But as mentioned, whilst we're having a chat about some of the questions we've already received, if you do have anything you want to ask Hannah, please do just pop it in the chat section, and we'll get round to it once we finish this next section. So I think a really logical place to kick off from is, obviously, as a documentary photographer, all of your work very clearly tells stories, and I think that's been very clear from the work that you've showed us. So where do you actually find the stories for your work?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, because I'm not sure there's any kind of one source. And the European Greenbelt project, I think I said before, actually, like I had been sort of like, I guess, kind of on the lookout for something to do that felt meaningfully connected to what I'd done before. And I was sort of conscious of like, not just like jumping around doing lots of different types of stories. Like I had this kind of idea about Poland and my Polish heritage, and that being somehow part of my work in an ongoing way. And then, yeah, I was listening to an episode of 99% Invisible, a fantastic podcast, which is actually about design. But they mentioned the European Greenbelt really in passing. It was this piece about like salmon farming. And they said something, oh, there's a salmon farm on the European Greenbelt, blah, blah, blah. And it was just like this fleeting thing. I was like, oh, what is the European Greenbelt? And I looked it up. And as soon as I read about it, I thought, that's so interesting. And I wonder if any work has been made about this. And yeah, I mean, not that I could find. Like there's incredible initiatives. There's this wilderness network. There's like all these different like sort of charitable organizations, but there don't seem to be many or any. I didn't find any sort of creative projects in response to this. So yeah, and also the idea sort of came about at just as the referendum to, you know, whether or not the UK was going to leave the European Union or not in 2016. So I sort of the idea had started to sort of like percolate probably about 6 months before the referendum vote. And the project, actually, the first part of it was going to be a collaboration with another photographer called Carl Bigmore, who for various reasons ended up kind of leaving the project after the first the first section, but we applied to the Royal Photographic Society and got the environmental bursary, and we found out we had the bursary a week after the Brexit vote. And I think that quite possibly they saw this project, like this act of crossing borders, like traversing the kind of breadth of Europe at a moment when the UK had voted to untangle itself from that. I don't know, it felt like quite a specifically intentional, you know, they didn't just like the idea, like it was, I think if the Brexit vote had gone the other way, maybe they wouldn't have funded our project. I don't know, like who's to say, but yeah, like the sort of politics of it has always felt very present in that body of work. And then like in terms of like any other work I've done, like I think like my approach, I've always got to have a sort of personal connection to it. I'm not yeah, I think, but like a personal connection could be just like really caring deeply about a subject. I think when it comes to environmental stories, like there's so many stories to be told at the moment. Like climate change is affecting kind of like top to bottom, like just every part of life, and whether that's human narratives or things that seem more kind of objectively just about land, or you know, even borders, even why are people crossing border, you know, like there's so much that needs to be told at the moment. So I feel like there's no lack of ideas. I suppose the other thing to say is that like as someone who, you know, I feel very much like I'm still kind of in the early part of my career as a photographer, and I definitely have a sense of not wanting to be like overstretched in sort of trying to tell too many stories. So you know, sometimes I feel really envious of some other photographers' projects that seem like really neat and packaged and like yeah, just like really, I really want to like do a really neat project, but I seem to not be able to rein it in. And yeah, but it's also part of my own commitment to wanting to really understand, and I think like part of my process is the research and really kind of embedding with the story, and yeah, I think that's the end of the answer.
No, I think that's really interesting as well, because I think the idea of stories organically coming to you as well, like you don't necessarily have to be seeking them out for something to strike inspiration, and it can come in the most unlikely of places. You like that entire thing that it wove such an interesting story from going, I heard a thing on a podcast which had been inspired all the way through to it following everything just falling into place. And I think that's a really interesting angle to think about things, because I think obviously sometimes as creatives you can kind of get a bit stuck in your head thinking, okay, right, what's my next idea, and sometimes, I
mean, something I've definitely never paid too much attention to, but maybe should have, is things like what is going to sell. And I think like some people shoot projects because they know that it's newsworthy, and that's fine if that's what they want to do. But I think like to me, I've never, like the few attempts I've done through that sort of line of thinking have just not really worked out for whatever reason. I think probably the reason is that like my motivations were kind of slightly in the wrong place. Like the work that I find has the most kind of meaning or engages people the most is the work that I really care about. I mean, maybe that's an obvious thing to say, but yeah.
No, but I think
also, oh sorry.
No, I was agreeing. It can definitely be really overlooked, especially in just personal connections to projects. I think sometimes, again, creators can get a little bit distracted by that.
Yeah, and I think also there's something about, I've been talking a lot about this recently with friends and colleagues, like the idea of kind of, on some level, like surrendering to a story as an artist or as a documentarian. Like there are things that you can try and seek out and kind of like bring into being, and then there's other things that just kind of cross your path and then you have to follow that path. And I think there's something about photography in particular, because of social media, that we are so exposed to what everyone else is up to, that it can feel like quite distracting, and like you don't quite have the kind of peace to be able to follow your own path. But I think it's really important that we do, and that we trust our own like instincts when it comes to, you know, visual representation, and trying to construct a visual narrative, like and silence Instagram sometimes, or just delete it off your phone once in a while.
I was really interested, because I think was it last week, that was like digital detox day, and I was like, you know what, I'm actually going to jump on board with this, and it's fascinating to see, actually sometimes you sort of get an over influx of, there's so much visual reference and inspiration out there, that sometimes that noise can get a little bit too distracting.
It's a really noisy industry. Exactly. Like, especially when you're actually a photographer, like everyone who's not a photographer is also using the medium. So it's good to, I mean, I also love Instagram for other reasons, but and I think I was just going to say as well, like, ideas for projects, I'm really interested in lots of different things and lots of different like creative forms, and I think it's kind of by accident that I've ended up with photography being like the thing, as much as I like it. But just kind of being open to hearing, to like listening to the world around you, and like seeing what's out there, and like really listening. I really think photographers like should listen almost like more than they look. Sometimes.
Completely agree. So I guess moving on to our next question, I think this one's probably going to be quite personal, because a lot of people are obviously here to think about their own practice and their own environmental practice. So is there a particular project you've done that you think has had sort of the greatest environmental impact?
I mean, the truth is, I'm not sure. I don't know yet. I hope that the European Green Belt project will help to kind of raise consciousness about that particular kind of environmental endeavor. But I think it's really hard to know the impact. I think we'll know in the future if we're all not suffocating from our own, like, you know, the mess that the world is getting, you know, is in now and is getting further into. That's kind of, I can only kind of hope that it has an environmental impact. Like, I mean, on a practical level, my practices have are definitely like shifting towards, in themselves, being more environmentally kind of respectful. Like last year, when I got this big commission for the Royal Shakespeare Company, I budgeted to do all this travel across Europe on trains rather than planes. And actually it was great. It was much more pleasant to do. And definitely, I should have checked, but I've got this app that tells you how much less carbon you're putting into the atmosphere by not flying on all those flights. And it was but I think like things like that, maybe that's the biggest impact, is just like, maybe it's not the work, I don't know, like maybe it's not the work, it's how the work's made that will make the biggest impact, or like lack of impact, you know.
And I think by doing that, obviously that can start a bit more of a chain reaction of other people seeing that it is something that's possible to be done. I think obviously even people who aren't necessarily thinking about this space, they'll naturally go to, I've got a shoot somewhere in Europe in like next month, I'll just go quickly, just jump on Skyscanner, but book my flight. And actually there's so much to be gained from an environmental perspective, but also just from a practitioner perspective of like taking the time out to spend your time traveling to a location. There's so much that could be learned from that. So I think,
I mean, it's not hard to do it. Like, to be honest with you, the most sort of like the biggest obstacle to get over is that you just have to plan it slightly more thoroughly than you would if you're just hopping on a plane, and maybe allow for an extra like 2 days, like one at either end of your trip. But it really wasn't, like, it was nice. It was much better traveling by train than flying, you know, much more leg room.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's,
and like your skin doesn't get all dehydrated. Like it was quite
just
good.
Just the personal side effects, it's worth doing.
Yeah.
So thinking a little bit more about what's happening now in the creative industry, especially within photography, is there anything that, in fact, actually, what most concerns you about what's currently happening in the creative industry?
In creative industries, I mean, there's much to be concerned about. I mean, obviously, like, this is an insanely difficult time for any creative practitioner, just in terms of making a living, and obviously with lockdown and COVID and like all the personal challenges that come with that. I mean, pretty much everyone I know, whatever their industry, is struggling in one way or another at the moment. So yeah, it's definitely like an incredibly difficult time, and I think the best thing we can do is you know, be supportive and friendly of each, you know, towards each other, and I think like with photography specifically, I think there's definitely an incredible shift that is happening, or that has been happening, and hopefully will continue to happen in the industry, in terms of just like raising the profile and raising the names and voices of photographers who are not white men. It's not that I don't like white men, it's just that there's more to it than that. And I feel like it's really heartening to see just the work of a more like broad range of perspectives. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir a bit here, but you know, obviously, like, our news, images are just such a part of our world, and if all those images that are seen by millions of people are just taken by the same or similar lived experience, like people with similar lived experiences, like that's not well, it's just very like homogenous, isn't it? And it's not enriching. And so I think, like, what was the question? What's happening?
What most concerns you?
What most concerns me? Okay, what most concerns me is paying for access to stuff. Like, I don't want to pay to, or I don't think any photographer who's starting out should have to pay to have a portfolio review, for example. I think the other thing that concerns me is that some people are still quite scared to have difficult conversations, and actually, when people have brave conversations about difficult things, like, change does happen. So that concerns me, but I'm also heartened by the kind of like inroads that people are making to have those difficult conversations. I think it's fantastic, and I hope that everyone continues to have difficult conversations.
Yeah. I think as well, because obviously with all the negatives that's come with COVID, I think the one thing that it has forced people to do is put those difficult conversations to the forefront, and I think that's only a positive thing, really, for the long term.
Definitely.
We did have a few more questions that were pre-sent to us, but I'm aware that we're already starting to run out of time, so I want to make sure that we cover some of the questions we've got from people watching. And actually, there's a question that ties in quite nicely to what you were discussing about the people who are taking photography and the prominence of white male photographers, basically. So Nancy's mentioned there seems to me to be a real connection between misogyny and anti-environment so-called leaders, so Trump, Johnson. I'm thinking of the statement by Indigenous midwife and the protector Katsy Cook, who states, "Women are the first environment." So she's interested to hear your own thoughts on what it's like to be female photographer when approaching environmental work. I think that's quite apt, obviously, because you're part of the women photography.
I'm part of Women Photograph as well, the network. Yeah. Can you say that quote again? Actually, or maybe I can find it for me. Women are the first environment. Yeah, that's so interesting. How it is to be a female photographer approaching environmental work. I mean, I'm really lucky because I have land art agency and I've had some good opportunities and I'm part of Women Photograph. I think, I mean, there are still instances where someone would assume that you can't do something because you're a woman. But I'm not sure I'd actually say like the hardest challenge as a female photographer is actually maybe like, I don't know if this is like a generalization, but I feel like it's quite hard to be, to get your foot in the door with the gatekeepers. But so my answer to that was to set up Photo Scratch and Isle and be part of Women Photograph and kind of try and like puncture the power structures by creating not my own power structures, but by creating opportunity that actually benefits more than just me, and trying to kind of puncture the hierarchy in the industry by saying, I mean, Photo Scratch has been really successful at puncturing that hierarchy. I think like you get a real cross-section of experience at Photo Scratch, in terms of like experience in the industry. You know, you get people who've been doing it for years and then recent grads all kind of muddling along together. So I think like basically choosing a path that is about, I'm sure someone's heard me say this before, but like choosing collaboration over competition as like a strategy, as a survival strategy, you know, is what I try and do. I think it's a really, you know, poignant question though, to do with, you know, women and the environment. Like, you know, not many governments, but it's taken governments around the world a long time to come around to the sort of seriousness of climate change and global warming. And I feel like, you know, there's been all these studies about how it's, you know, it's most affecting women. And it's not that surprising that governments aren't that on board with it. Like the track record is they don't really get on board with things that, you know, women basically always come second when it comes to policies. I mean, I was reading a book last year about the fact that, you know, most medications are not even tested on women, and car seats and safety belts are for male shaped bodies.
Yeah.
So like,
in so many projects, I've been actually looking at loads of projects recently about the idea of 71%, I think, of more women are more likely to die in a car accident, for example, because it's not
right.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, so like the odds are really stacked against women at like on an average day. Yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question. I mean, thoughts on how it is to be a female photographer? I mean, I love photography, and I love the work that I've been lucky enough to do. I also have a tremendous amount of respect for many other women photographers, female photographers, as well as male photographers. But I think like with the general odds stacked against us, I kind of applaud louder for the women, maybe. Yeah,
I think it's just one of those challenges that we just need to keep. I think at the minute there is no one size fits all solution to quality in photography, but I think
totally. But I do think that the more organizations like Women Photograph, like the Photo Bill of Rights initiative, even the NUJ, the more these sort of the more people get organized and apply pressure for change, the better. And I think like if lockdown has kind of re-engaged or, you know, sort of engaged a new generation of people to kind of fight for, you know, fight for their rights and fight fight for what they believe to be right, then that's, you know, it's a good silver lining to a really fucking crazy, awful situation.
Definitely. So because you've obviously been talking a little bit more about photo scratch in that response, as well as one of the ways that you're trying to do something in this area. So Melanie's asked, how do you feel about collaborating and working with other photographers? Does that inform your practice?
Definitely, yeah. I really love collaborating with other people. I think yeah, I come from a theatre and filmmaking background, and when I trained as an actor, like, it was all about the ensemble, and that's something I've not been able to shake off. Which, you know, has its challenges when, you know, you're looking at a single frame, you know, what's in the frame, it can be photographed by one hand, really. You press the button, you took the photo. But yeah, I love collaborations, and I'm really I'm like super lucky to have worked with, well, like pretty much everyone I've worked with has been very sort of nourishing. And I think that's the other thing, like, some people would feel, I think, like any collaboration as a photographer, you have to be really clear about what your expectations are and what your kind of limits are and what your boundaries are, and then see what happens when you're both generating the ideas and being sort of mutually supportive. And yeah, it's can you just tell me the question one more time? Sorry, I'm getting distracted because I can see.
So it's just
yeah, how do you feel about collaborating, working with other photographers? Does this inform your practice? Yeah, I mean, photo scratch has been amazing, actually, for, like, on just a specific reason of the fact that I've been able to see, like, a cross section of projects and get some insight into how other photographers actually build their projects. I mean, anyone can see this if you come to a photo scratch event or you log into one when we next have an online one. Like, it's really interesting to get some insight into how people develop work and how people ask questions, or what happens when they're not asking the right questions, and how do you, I suppose, as like a peer, how do you feed back to that person or ask a question that might help them unlock a part of the work that they've sort of overlooked or haven't thought about yet. And definitely, yeah, I feel like I've learned so much from other photographers through running photo scratch. And I mean, I sort of touched on this before, but like from a curatorial perspective, like Isle's been really just a joy to do, like hard as well, like hard work, but also a joy. And like sort of applying, you know, it's that thing, like, you're kind of always better at editing someone else's work than your own. I suppose it's a similar thing, but like seeing my work in the context of being next to Linda Laird's work or Nicola's or Celine's, like it like it has a new meaning, and in a way I can sort of slightly disassociate from my own, like I'm not as critical of my own work maybe when it's next to their work or something, you know. It's like just getting out of your own way and kind of doing something that's for a common purpose maybe means that I'm less getting in my own way with criticism, I think. So yeah, it definitely informs my practice in like a nice way, but it is also a challenge, you know. You have to be quite organized and you know, have Google Docs and stuff to keep things in order.
I think it's a good life lesson as well to be open to collaboration and be willing to accept things like criticism. I think sometimes, again, as an artist, it can be quite tough to hear people say the negatives behind your work, and actually,
but also how to give the criticism as well, how to offer generous criticism that isn't like a total put down, like what's positive that you see in someone's work, but what about this, like how to pose questions in a way that helps open doors for the photographer rather than make them feel small and shit. Yeah,
I think very much. I think there's so many clients out there who could definitely benefit from learning a bit more about helpful criticism sometimes. This might end up being our last question. I don't think we've had any more through. If anyone does have any more questions, make sure you quickly type them in the box before we finish up. But Louise asked, I just got 2 questions. Why were you not entirely daunted by the amount of land you had to cover when you were doing a Wingbat project?
Why was I not entirely daunted? I'm not sure. I really should have been entirely daunted. And I think, to be honest, like that is one of my kind of like current regrets about the project, is that it's just so big a project that it's really hard to put it in a medium that is consumable by an audience. Like that is the challenge I'm currently facing. You know, that many weeks of travel and, you know, all of those places, like how do you represent the story in a way that is that you're not leaving anywhere out, or, you know, you have to just basically make a choice about what goes in and what goes out. And yeah, I mean, I think I was just maybe a bit naive. I don't know. I mean, I traveled for the project about my grandmother's experience, and had ended up with a similar kind of just like absolute like mound of photographs to wade through. I do shoot on film for most of my work, so you know, there's maybe not quite as many millions of captures as there would be if it was digital, but yeah, I don't know how I wasn't entirely daunted. I think like I probably was, but I also thought, I just thought, how hard can it be?
I think sometimes naivety in projects is actually quite a beneficial.
I mean, to be completely honest with you though, like I've done like emergency first aid training, and I've done like security, like all this, I've done all this like protocol understanding, like how do you risk assess for major projects when you're on the road in war zones. Not that I have any intention to go to a war zone, but I happen to have done quite a lot of training for emergency, you know, first aid, and I put together, every time I do a trip, I put together like a pack of contacts and the nearest hospitals, and like how to get out, and like where the nearest border, like all that stuff, which maybe makes me sound a bit paranoid, but actually if you have that kind of information, you just feel a bit more prepared. And I do, whenever I travel abroad, I always do like quite a lot of research about kind of like current what the current state of play is somewhere, and like, you know, even just going onto the government website about each country in the world has a page on the UK government website advising about travel to that country and what you can expect. I mean, to be fair, like that website is maybe not always totally accurate, but it prepares you for the worst, and then you get there and it's usually never as crazy as the UK government would lead you to believe. So yeah, so I think I just like tried to equip myself with some practical insight and knowledge about the different places I'd be traveling to, like on a practical risk level. Yeah, I don't know.
No, that's really interesting.
The photographing is like the easy part.
It's the preparing yourself for the journey. And then as an extension to that question, did you see much evidence of the Cold War on your travels? Yeah,
tons. Like the whole project is really, it's really an interplay. Like the pictures that I've taken are really, you know, they kind of, there are some like incredible kind of wilderness vista type views, but then there's also, yeah, just like so many traces of the Cold War. I mean, particularly when you're like, there's something quite profound, I think, about the fact that lots of these national parks, take Latvia, for example. In Latvia, there was this one national park I visited where during the Cold War, no Latvians were actually allowed to go into this area that is now a national park. And that was because there was a Soviet military base there. And I mean, sort of drawing from one of the interviews that I carried out with a woman in Riga, she expressed the fact that it felt like they were living a double life because they were having to kind of be Russian and but whilst also trying to maintain their identity as Latvians. And she said how, like, she actually cried when she spoke to me about this, because even just the memory of it, like, they really weren't allowed to be free people in their own country during that time. And now, of course, you know, it's a national park, and they encourage the, you know, civilians to go and visit the national park, and it's lovely, but there's all these, you know, former Soviet military bases, like all this sort of ruined buildings and everything. So it's got this sort of real, like, bittersweet, like, energy to it, and feeling when you're there, because on the one hand it's lovely and beautiful, but it's got this kind of strange, like, oppressive, yeah, like legacy.
Yeah, I think, and I think Nancy's made quite an interesting point there on that legacy as well. It's like, even just the global warming of Cold War is just a whole other,
yeah, that's true,
everything. So I'll finish off with our very last question. I'll try and quickly get this one in. Have you thought about making a film of your work?
Of that project specifically?
Yeah, I think that was asked when we were talking about that project. So.
Oh, right. Well, it's funny because I did film quite a lot of stuff. I filmed lots of footage as well, and I've thought about ways to make, I basically wanted to, like, the dream version of the project would be in an exhibition space with an immersive projected kind of environmental, like, so you'd be able to walk through some of the environments, as well as seeing the still images. So when I did my Poland project, that was actually an installation piece as well as the stills, with an audio voiceover. So I've always been quite up for experimental ways of delivering documentary work. So yeah, I suppose, like, a film in the traditional sense, no, but in an installation sort of immersive theatre sense, yes.
I can really imagine how that, I've already got visions of how great that is.
And actually I'm just starting, like, on a separate note, I am just starting to work on a film project with another collaborator, so film's definitely something that's kind of on my, like, in my orbit at the moment. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I think that's going to be all we've got time for now. Thank you, everybody, for your really insightful questions. So a huge thank you to you, Hannah, for
thank you.
everything that you spoke about today. It was just really lovely and insightful to hear everything from you. And I say, as again, thank you, everybody, for your questions today.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, and so just as a reminder, you can stay up to date with all things land art related, and also just continue this conversation if you'd like to, on our Instagram, which is at Land Art Collective, or on our Twitter, which is at Land Art Agency. And obviously don't forget to take a look at our September and October series of workshops, including that one run by Hannah. You can look at all of our workshops at landartagency.com/workshops. So a huge thank you to everybody, and hopefully we'll see you in one of our workshops or another one of our Q&As sometime soon.